Surprise! There's more than 7 continents on our planet. Argoland, a hidden continent, may help us understand how our planet will look in the future. To find out how it hid from us and what secrets it holds, well, you'll just have to keep watching. Ready for a mystery? Scientists have been looking for a piece of land that's been missing for over 100 million years. Not exactly newsworthy, since people search for information about our planet's history all the time. You'd think it was probably this minuscule island somewhere in the middle of an ocean. Well, you'd be wrong, because this continent used to be as big as the entire U.S. territory. For a long time, geologists have been wondering whether a massive chunk of contemporary Australia vanished into thin air. Some believed it was simply hiding somewhere on the ocean floor. But thanks to some Dutch specialists and 7 years of investigating, we now know there are bits and pieces of this lost land mixed underneath the lush jungles of Southeast Asia. The continents we see in our geography manuals these days are like scattered pieces of a puzzle. There's even a nice experiment you can conduct to see for yourself. Find a world map online and print it out. Cut out all of the continents and play around with them for a while. You'll see they all fit together. Probably the most striking thing you'll see is how South America perfectly fits near Africa. If you close up the oceans that were formed in the last 200 million years, the continents look like they form a giant letter C. And that C is what scientists call the supercontinent Pangaea. It was swimming in an ocean called Panthalassa, and the inner portion of that letter C had a smaller stretch of water called the Tethys Ocean. It is in this small ocean where things get interesting. Back in the Jurassic period, this vanished continent, which scientists started calling Argoland, vanished and left a hole in Australia, now known as the Argo-Abyssal Plain. Geologists initially believed this was all due to a process called subduction. It's when one piece of the Earth's crust dives under another and recycles it into the planet's mantle. Usually, specialists track this continental vanishing through off-scraping. That's how they figured out, for instance, that India bumped into Asia and gave us the majestic Himalayan mountains. But for Argoland, things were a bit more complicated. Bits and pieces were popping up in places like Myanmar and Indonesia, but they behaved like these time-traveling relics, looking way older than when Argoland supposedly separated from Australia. It immediately raised the question: if one continent can behave so weirdly, how many others are out there doing the same? Thankfully, scientists have now put together the entire timeline of Argoland and figured out its mystery. It didn't sink or get swallowed up. It simply transformed into an archipelago, breaking into smaller pieces, called microcontinents, and floating away from Australia. These mini-continents then took a little journey before settling down in Southeast Asian jungles. This discovery fits right into the whole Pangaea puzzle. It helps us better understand how continents break up and make up, all in one discovery, revealing secrets of biodiversity and climate back from in the day. If you'd like to find out more secrets about history, civilization, or random day-to-day objects, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Like, for instance, the mystery behind this invisible species line in Indonesia. It's called the Wallace Line, named after the British explorer Alfred Russel Wallace. Over 150 years ago, Wallace was on a journey around the Malay archipelago, visiting thousands of islands. What he found was that animals on one side of this invisible line were considerably different from ones on the other side. This invisible line is like a wall between marsupials and tigers, for instance, or honey-eaters and trogons. But now we know that around 35 million years ago, Australia broke up with Antarctica and collided with Asia, and this continental love triangle triggered significant changes. It didn't just change the way the land looked, it also messed with the species of animals on each side of the Wallace Line. In more recent times, a bunch of specialists published a study saying this collision and climate chaos made Asian species comfy living in the Malay archipelago. Meanwhile, the Aussie animals weren't as happy with the new environment. It was too hot and wet for some, and others just couldn't handle the tropical island lifestyle. The discovery of this continental shift towards Asia might also explain a recent finding of a human species that didn't seem to make any sense either. You see, in this hidden cave in the Philippines, archaeologists stumbled upon a new human ancestor. It seems that about 50,000 years ago, on the island of Luzon, there was this ancient human-like species. The lead researcher believed this finding was crucial for understanding human evolution in Asia, and it named this new species after the island, Homo luzonensis. Now, here's where it gets a bit confusing. The bones found by archaeologists had one small problem. They had a weird mix of traits that hadn't been seen together in any other hominid species. Smaller teeth, similar to ours, yet hands and feet that were more like our ancient humanoid ancestors. It was those throwback limbs in particular that connected this human species with the long-lost Southern Territory. That's because they have this primitive look, like these hard-to-pronounce guys, for instance. Only these two species are separated by 2 to 3 million years of time in evolution. Many have wondered, is Homo luzonensis really a new species? Not everyone is convinced. But it may also explain why living creatures are also affected by the constant shifting of the land underneath us. Now, just because they haven't changed much during our lifetime, it doesn't mean our continents will look like this forever. They evolved from this large megacontinent, and they'll most likely end up in a similar position in the future. On that note, a geologist from a European university tried to predict the future of Earth's supercontinents. As a starting point, he used an earthquake that occurred in Portugal back in 1755, when tectonic plates behaved a bit differently than they should have. After years of research, he came up with a theory in 2016. He believed that the stitches between these tectonic plates might be coming apart, setting the stage for a bigger rupture. It's like when glass cracks between two holes in a car windshield. If this happens, a subduction zone could stretch from the Mediterranean all the way up past Ireland, bringing volcanoes, earthquakes, and new mountains to these areas. If all goes according to this plan, the Atlantic Ocean will disappear, and so will the Pacific, turning into one large stretch of water. Instead of the 7 continents we know today, we'll get a new supercontinent, which he called Arica, because it would have Australia and the Americas at its heart. Now, it's not the only possible scenario, though. Novo Pangea might be another, and it's easy to foresee. The Atlantic stays open and the Pacific closes. Then there's Amasia. For this one, you'd have to imagine the Arctic Ocean closing and the Atlantic and Pacific staying open. Everything shifts to the north around the North Pole, except Antarctica. One final scenario would be called Pangea Ultima. Slow down the spreading in the Atlantic, and a new subduction plate pops up on the America's east coast. Well, either way, if all the continents collide in the future once more, some say it won't be fun to experience. It's believed that in around 250 million years, we'll feel like we're being trapped in a sweltering, soggy plastic bag. Weirdly, that bag will be the best place to live on Earth, the coastal areas. As for the inland spots, they'll be sizzling, like a desert on fire. Many of the species of animals we know today might not make it. As for us humans, we'll need to be creative if we want to withstand the heat. We should be thankful, though. These digital models are still great because we can use them to test all sorts of interesting ideas. For example, how these supercontinents would mess with tides. Taking future space travels into consideration, these models can help us understand the climates of exoplanets too. Those are located outside our solar system.
The theory of parallel worlds has been discussed in the scientific community for a very long time. Unfortunately, we're not developed enough yet to prove or disprove it. But it's still an interesting theory, and that's why we have a lot of unusual urban legends about the guests from a parallel reality, according to many. Let's check out a few of them. A man from a non-existent country. This story took place in 1851 in a small German village, Frankfurt an der Oder. A lost man came out to the local villagers asking for help. The man introduced himself as Jopar Voren. He spoke very poor German and had a very strong accent. The man himself claimed that he speaks Laxar and Abram. languages that don't actually exist on our Earth. He claimed to be from Laxaria, a country on the mainland called Sacria, separated from Europe by a huge ocean. However, none of these places existed on the Earth's map. People sent Yopar to the local authorities. He talked to a psychiatrist, but the doctor concluded that the man was totally sane. An investigation by the local police also revealed nothing suspicious about him. Yopar Vorin claimed that the purpose of his visit to Europe was to find his long-lost brother. He survived a shipwreck and found himself near the village. They showed him a map of the world and a globe and asked him to indicate the place where he crashed, but he didn't recognize anything familiar. He seemed to have extensive knowledge about his homeworld. Yopar named 5 main continents on it: Sacria, Aflar, Ostar, Auslar, and Uplar. His story was considered plausible. Scientists from Frankfurt decided to send the man to Berlin for further research. However, during the trip, he had something like a seizure. The man suddenly jumped out of the carriage and disappeared into the surrounding forest. Despite a long and thorough search, no traces of Yopar were found. He seemed to have disappeared as mysteriously as he had appeared. Inspector Leboeuf, who was assigned to escort him to Berlin, thought this man could be a being from another world, and that he had returned from where he had come from. Lady on Highway 167. This incident happened on October 20th, 1969. It was first reported in 1988 in the magazine Strange. The article tells about 2 men, LC and his business partner, Charlie. The names are fictitious. One afternoon, LC and Charlie were driving along Highway 167 in southwest Louisiana. Discussing work, they drove toward the oil center of Lafayette. The highway was empty at first, but then the men noticed a very old and very slow car ahead. The men started discussing this mysterious car. Such cars hadn't been produced for several decades, but this one looked quite new. The men thought it was thanks to the owner's care and admired it. They slowed down to get a better look at the car. LC noticed a bright orange sign on it that said 1940. They saw a driver. It was a young woman in old-fashioned clothes, a hat with a long feather and a fur coat, even though it was warm outside. There was a child next to her, also dressed in a warm coat and a hat. LC and Charlie wanted to talk to her, but then they noticed the expression on her face. The woman was looking around in panic, almost on the verge of crying. LC called out to her and asked if she needed help. She nodded, and he gestured for her to park on the side of the road. But when the men also parked, they suddenly noticed that the woman's car had disappeared. They looked around the highway in shock. She couldn't have gone somewhere far so fast, but the car was nowhere to be found. After some time, another man drove up to LC and Charlie. He saw everything that happened and claimed that the car had simply disappeared. The men talked about the incident for several hours. When they reached the city, they contacted the police. However, the police couldn't help them in any way. Apart from their words, there was no confirmation of the existence of the car. The case was discussed for a while in local newspapers, and then was forgotten. The Gadianton Canyon Incident. This incident occurred in May of 1972 in southeastern Utah near the Modena Railroad crossing on the edge of the Escalante Desert. Jenna North was driving her father's 1971 Chevrolet Nova. Her friend, Carol Abbott, was in the passenger seat. In the back seat, there were 2 other girls, Lisa Rockford and Bethany Gordon. It was after 10 p.m. when the girls crossed the Utah-Nevada state line. They wanted to get back to campus before their housekeeper, Mrs. Mortensen, locked the dorm doors. This stretch of Highway 56 in Utah is pretty deserted. There's nothing there but sand and a few plants. The girls were very happy when they finally noticed the Union Pacific Railroad crossing in Modena. But right behind the railing, Jenna noticed 2 highways. One went into the desert, and the other to Gadianton Canyon. The girls decided to take the road to the canyon. They thought it would be a shortcut to campus. The other girls were chatting with each other when Jenna noticed that they were no longer driving on asphalt, but on white cement. "Watch out!" suddenly shouted one of the girls. The road ended abruptly at a high rock wall. It was a dead end. They had to go back the same way they came here. And while Jenna's friends were complaining that now they would have to sleep in the car, Jenna saw that the landscape had changed dramatically. They weren't in the desert anymore. Instead, the canyon turned into an open area with wheat fields, pine thickets, and a small lake ahead. A full moon was shining in the sky, which was strange because it shouldn't have been there that night. The girls had no idea where they were, so they just drove to the light ahead. It was some building that they thought was a diner or restaurant. The girls saw a bright neon sign, but none of them could read what was written on it. These symbols were unlike any language they knew. Suddenly, several people came out of the building. They seemed shocked and frightened by Jenna's Chevrolet. They waved their hands and shouted something, but the girls didn't understand them. Lisa decided to ask the men for directions. She stuck her head out of the window and immediately let out a terrifying scream. "Get out of here!" she shouted to Jenna. The Chevrolet sped away from the building. Bright headlights illuminated their car from behind. They were being chased by a few vehicles. These vehicles were egg-shaped, had 3 wheels, and made a buzzing sound. The road ahead led back to the canyon. Jenna didn't have time to slow down and crashed right into it. The vehicles had disappeared, together with an unfamiliar landscape. The girls were back in the desert again. Fortunately, none of them were hurt, physically. But Lisa was in a state of shock. She was saying again and again, "They weren't human!" The girls had to help her walk. An hour later, they were able to stop a Utah Highway Patrol car. They told the police their story. The details of the report compiled by the police officer were complicated and confusing. During the investigation, the police couldn't figure out from the tire tracks exactly where the car went astray. The tracks ended very abruptly, as if the Chevrolet had suddenly disappeared. The police couldn't explain how the car could have driven 2 miles without leaving any traces, especially on such solid ground. There are still disputes about this story, but in the end, all versions and explanations of what happened are just guesses. Perhaps we'll never find out the truth. These were the urban legends about interdimensional traveling. Of course, there's no proof that any of these stories are real. Often the truth turns out to be very mundane. For example, the famous man from Taured, who people also called a guest from another reality, turned out to be a simple fraudster named John Allen Kuchar Zegrus. But even so, these stories are still very interesting. Scientists claim that Icelandia was a region between Greenland and Scandinavia that was more than 230,000 square miles, but is now underwater. The Earth was once a large pizza pie, with all the continents connected to each other millions of years ago, otherwise known as Pangaea. The North Atlantic region we know today was dry land from about 335 million to 175 million years ago. For many years, scientists and geologists assumed that the North Atlantic Ocean was birthed as Pangaea began to split apart roughly 200 million years ago. With volcanoes in the region where Iceland is, the country came to be just 60 million years ago as it broke off and sailed away from all the other lands. And since the Earth was like a large pizza pie, it divided like one. Many of the lands split up into many large and small pieces, creating the continents we know today. But this new theory suggests that the result of Pangaea's splitting left out some land that stretched for around 200 miles. And just about 10 million years ago, that piece of land submerged in the waters on the eastern and western side, leaving the tip of the land, which is now Iceland. When plate tectonics move, they grind on each other, which gave shape to our current landscape, all thanks to the mantle. This new radical theory goes against everything written in history books and what scientists have been studying. They began shaking heads, drawing lots of skepticism and criticism. But by analyzing the ocean floor under Iceland and the Earth's crust, we can assume that this idea isn't far-fetched. the crust beneath Iceland happens to be a lot thicker than the typical ones. Oceanic crust is made up of unique melted rocks compared to the land crusts where we walk and live on, and is a lot more denser. The thinnest layer on Earth is the crust, where life takes place. It's essential for water, growing food, gathering natural resources and minerals, and breathing in oxygen. It sinks below to the bottom, but right above the Earth's mantle. It also refreshes itself, since it constantly gets recycled into the mantle and back up. This is why the rocks in the oceanic crust are around 25 miles thick, compared to just 5 miles anywhere else. This is also reasonable given that it's in a hotspot for volcanoes. Magnetic surveys of the ocean floor show layers of molten crust in stripe patterns. Also, given the fact that the Earth's magnetic field changed its polarity over millions of years, it played a role in shaping the foundation of our landscape. But there isn't any concrete evidence to prove this new theory just yet. One of the first steps is to start digging the ocean floor near Iceland. Zircon is a very sturdy mineral that can last for billions of years despite erosion in the Earth's crust. By taking samples and studying them, researchers can estimate the geological age of the continents. This will make sure the crust is oceanic, which is thicker, or continental, which is the regular crust we walk on. This isn't an overnight project and would come with a hefty cost. Another way is to do seismic surveys that can measure echoes conducted on research ships. Drilling holes miles deep in the crust can also help with the research, but this would cost more than studying the zircon minerals. Some fossilized plants unique to both Scandinavia and Greenland might prove that Icelandia was once on the surface and possibly scattered with trees. It wasn't a cold land as it is today, so it may have had forests. But scientists still haven't found fossil evidence of animals common in both lands to suggest anything. But maybe time will tell. The theory goes deeper, which suggests that there was a greater Icelandia. With Iceland, Ireland, Britain, Scandinavia, and Greenland all in one microcontinent, it could be a destination of winter enthusiasts and great for skiing. It could be possible to connect Canada to Greater Icelandia by train over the ocean, which would open up the economy even more. Iceland is around 40,000 square miles, which is already quite big. And if the Greater Icelandia was present today, then Europe would be a completely different continent. Many theories are circulating about other possible hidden microcontinents around the world. Scientists aren't certain of the possibility of Icelandia's existence, but if all the studies conducted were done correctly, then the theory could change everything we know about Iceland and the North Atlantic Ocean. And this could pave the way for other sunken microcontinents around the world. Another theory out there is that New Zealand was the tip of a lost subcontinent, even bigger than Icelandia, called Zealandia. Studies show that it's separated from the supercontinent Gondwana between 79 to 83 million years ago. Scientists claim that it's the thinnest and youngest continent discovered underwater. Craton is a core rock that acts as the main foundation for most continents. It's at least 1 billion years old, but the continental crust that makes up Zealandia is just half of that, which makes it quite young. That means some Craton is missing, even though it holds some leftovers of older rocks and parts of the mantle. They're estimated to be as old as 2.7 billion years old. Scientists did some studies on the zircon crystals from New Zealand and found out that they're as old as 1.3 billion years old. The rest of the continents are more than 3 billion years old. Scientists studied the composition of the rocks in the bottom of the ocean around New Zealand. They're made up of silica and granite, which are found in continental crusts. The ocean floors mainly have magnesium and iron-rich rocks. They're also thicker and higher than regular ocean crusts around it. They conducted some studies and collected magnetic and topographic data to see the link between the Tasman and Coral Seas in the Cato Trough region. This is the narrow strip between Zealandia and Australia. Satellite data tracked tiny faults in the Earth's gravity to map out the crust of the ocean floor surrounding the area. They saw the mass that makes up Zealandia quite visible and almost the size of Australia. Even though the signs are there, this doesn't prove anything. It's possible that there are a bunch of microcontinents which all split apart when Australia broke free of Gondwana. Back then, the supercontinent was made up of South America, Antarctica, Australia, Zealandia, Arabia, and the Indian subcontinent. New Zealand is already not the biggest country out there, but if the theories are correct, then Zealandia will be 6 times its original size. Mauritius is a young island that's only a few million years old. Just 1,200 miles off the coast of Africa, it's believed that the tiny island came to life around 9 million years ago. The underwater volcanoes in the region spewed out so much lava that it formed the land today. But scientists found zircon rocks that are more than 3 billion years old. It may also be part of a continent submerged underwater called Mauritia, which is just a quarter of the size of Madagascar. The zircons they found were embedded in solid rocks and not just in the sand, which may rule out that they just washed up on shore from another continent. Some scientists are still not convinced. They suggest that discovering rocks that stand out from the other typical ones brought by an eruption could skew the scientific community to this theory. But just like how Icelandia could be part of Greater Icelandia, Mauritia was once called Rodinia, which consisted of India and Madagascar. Theories suggest that Mauritia was covered in water when India broke away from Madagascar, something like 85 million years ago.
Strange and amazing items are discovered often, but figuring out what our ancestors were up to is pretty tough. Especially when all you have are just some rusty cups and cave drawings. It's no surprise that even the experts in lab coats sometimes make mistakes. But it's not just about dusty plates and huge stones. Sometimes there's even humans with large heads. So grab your digging tools and let's travel back to ancient times to explore incredible societies that even scientists can't fully explain. Sardinia may look idyllic now, but I'm not gonna lie, I wouldn't fancy visiting it 3,000 years ago. Rumor has it, terrible giants roamed around this island back then. People even talk about finding human skeletons over 13 feet tall there, although nobody's ever shown anything to prove it. But the stories will make you wonder because some weird stuff has definitely happened. In 1974, over 5,000 pieces of broken stone artifacts were found in a part of the island called Monte Prama, but instead of being displayed in a museum, they were locked up in an underground vault for about 30 years. Sounds a bit suspicious, doesn't it? When they were finally displaced in 2005, scientists put the pieces together to find statues of 38 giant men standing 8 feet tall. Not quite as tall as the legendary skeletons, but still pretty huge. It's thought these statues were made by the Nuragic people, who lived on the island a long time ago. Besides giant statues, they also built over 8,000 massive stone buildings. Perhaps Nuragic weren't giants themselves, but they definitely liked their things big. I do too. I like a big number of likes on our videos. That would be pretty great. Thank you if you liked this and subscribed. Now back to the video. You and I are pretty smart, but we might not be the smartest humans ever. Actually, we might not even be the smartest species. Since 1913, some skull fossils found in South Africa have hinted at a possibly smarter contender called Boskop Man. This human-like species might have lived as recently as 10,000 years ago. Their skull suggests they had really big heads, which means their brains could have been 30% bigger than ours. Wow! Their average IQ could have been around 149, making them among the smartest 0.05% of people today. But if a Boskop Brainiac was so much smarter, why are they not around and we are? Well, bigger isn't always better, you know. Our brains are a lot bigger than our ape relatives, mainly in the prefrontal cortex. This part helps with high-level tasks like making decisions, remembering things short-term, and being aware of ourselves. The parts of the brain that handle our senses and movements haven't really grown much. So, maybe the boss cops spent too much time dwelling on the past rather than doing practical things like hunting. But this is all just guessing. We really don't know what happened to these clever cousins of ours. Some people even argue that boss cops weren't any different from us, with the only evidence being parts of skulls. The jungle is huge. Did you know the Amazon rainforest is home to about 30% of all the world's plant and animal species? That's impressive. However, the history of one native species, humans, has long puzzled scientists. The mysterious Kasarabe people lived here for hundreds of years and then vanished around 1400 AD. People thought the Amazon only had a few scattered tribes, but recently we discovered big, unusual shapes in the ground called geoglyphs. These might look like simple shallow ditches, but they're actually the remains of a vast civilization that spread over 5,000 square miles and includes about 450 markings, some as wide as 1,300 feet. That's insane! They likely contained ceremonial buildings and could have hosted up to 1 million people as recently as 550 years ago. Thanks to new technology like LiDAR, which uses a safe laser to map the forest without harming it, we can explore deeper. In 2019, some scans showed miles of raised roads and pathways and even pyramids over 70 feet tall. They found 26 separate settlements, 2 of which were at least 250 acres each. Damn, that's like 330 soccer fields. It's not certain what happened to the Kasarabe people. Maybe European conquistadors drove them out. Maybe the most baffling ancient civilization is one we've never actually found a trace of. Yep, I'm talking about Atlantis, the grand city that supposedly sank into the ocean. The first mentions of Atlantis come from the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, who talked about a great city near the Strait of Gibraltar. But for ages, everyone just thought Plato made up Atlantis as a perfect version of his own Athens. So why, about 12,000 years after it supposedly vanished, do we still wonder if it might be real? Well, in the 19th century, U.S. Congressman Ignatius Donnelly wrote a book giving 13 reasons why he thought Atlantis was more than just a myth. Then, in 1965, some folks thought they actually found Atlantis when they discovered the Richat structure, a massive 25-mile-wide dome in Mauritania, Africa. It's so big that you can see the whole thing from space. 2 astronauts flying over the Sahara Desert spotted this giant eye staring back at them and thought they'd made the discovery of a lifetime. Unfortunately, there's no solid evidence linking this structure to Atlantis. It's believed to have formed from volcanic activity about 100 million years ago. But it does look suspicious, doesn't it? Still, we're no closer to knowing the truth. Imagine going back to about 3,300 BCE and finding yourself in South Asia. Welcome to the Harappan civilization. These people were way ahead of their time. They had cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, complete with baked brick houses, sophisticated drainage systems, and even public baths. This place might have had over 5 million people, making it one of the densest regions at the time. They also invented a system of standardized weights that was incredibly useful for traders. And trading they did. These people had connections stretching all the way to the Middle East, thanks to their great skills in metallurgy. They even had a form of ancient branding. The seals were used to stamp clay on tray goods. Despite being so advanced with a thriving urban life, there's a whole bunch of mystery shrouding their language and script. We've got bits and pieces of their writing, but no one's deciphered them yet, even with all the technology we have today. We also still don't know how exactly their society worked. It looks like they didn't flaunt their social status as much as other civilizations. No grand palaces or massive monuments. Instead, their largest buildings might have been granaries. They sure were practical. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. Around 1800 BCE, this bustling civilization started to decline, possibly due to shifts in river patterns. As the environment changed, the Harappans packed up, moving towards more hospitable lands. Ever heard of the Minotaur? The beast with a bull's head and a man's body, hunting the bravest travelers in a massive maze. Well, this wasn't just any old tale. It was one of the most popular dramas of the ancient world, and it was inspired by this place, the island of Crete. The Minoans lived here during the Bronze Age. They had stunning palaces, amazing frescoes, and a culture so rich it still fascinates historians to this day. They built places like Knossos, which was so complex with its multi-story buildings and elaborate hallways that it might have inspired the whole labyrinth myth. Their engineering was so ahead of its time that even their drainage systems were more advanced than what many of us have today. Let me know in the comments which of these stories you find the most fascinating, and thanks for watching.
How about playing golf? Not on Earth, but on the moon. Let's journey back to a time 50 years ago when one astronaut turned the lunar surface into the most unusual golf course ever. Any golfer will tell you how tricky it is to avoid sand traps, but picture Alan Shepard, a NASA astronaut dealing with an entire surface that feels like super fine powder. During the Apollo 14 mission, he took a break to showcase some spacey golf skills for everyone watching from Earth. After his first shot, he excitedly made another. For him, it seemed the ball went forever and ever. Let's dial back to reality for a moment. Thanks to the research by the United States Golf Association, or USGA, we've got some numbers. They found that Alan's first moon ball traveled 24 yards, and his second stretched for 40 yards. Now, how does that compare to the average golf shots back here? In regular gravity, one usually swings to about 216 yards. Just goes to show, while we've upgraded our golf game on Earth with tech and training, the moon's low-gravity playground is a different environment altogether. Now let's give Alan some props. Moon golf? Not as simple as you might think. His club wasn't one from your local sports store, it was a makeshift one. A moon sample collector with a club head stuck to it. Add to that the bulky spacesuit he had on. Imagine trying to swing wearing an outfit that's as stiff as cardboard. With all that gear, Alan could only muster a one-handed swing. Care to have a similar experience? Well, you might not be able to play golf on the moon anytime soon, but you can give it a shot underwater. Some say the conditions are similar. Here's where it gets even more interesting. The USGA didn't just take Alan's word on where the balls landed. They wanted to investigate. For starters, they used ultra-clear footage of the Apollo 14 mission. They also used some sharp images from NASA's special moon camera, launched in 2009. Using this imagery, they mapped out the journey of those two golf balls. Alan loved his unique golf club so much, he wanted to bring it back home. No big deal, right? Well, you see, in those days, astronauts would leave behind unnecessary items to make space for moon rocks. But not this club. So during the 70s, this interstellar golf club found a new home at the USGA Museum in New Jersey. Unlike regular golf clubs, this one had a twist. It was crafted from aluminum and Teflon. It was built to fold and fit snugly within the tight spaces of the lunar lander. How did this whole moon golf idea even pop up? Well, in 1970, golf legend Bob Hope paid a visit to NASA. Inspired by Hope's love for golf, an idea came into Shepard's head: moon golf. To turn his dream into reality, he collaborated with a golf professional and NASA's tech specialists. Together, they crafted a club that met NASA's strict safety norms. But hey, Alan didn't want this to be just a surprise stunt. Remember, traveling to the moon required very strict protocols. They couldn't just randomly have a picnic up there, you know? So, Alan made sure NASA officials agreed with this impromptu game of golf. They were initially skeptical, but eventually gave the green light after Alan passionately laid out his plan. He also promised he'd start playing if everything went smoothly on the mission. Determined to make it perfect, Alan prepped like a champ. The story goes that he'd put on his hefty spacesuit and sneak off to secret spots so he could practice. Decades later, he'd still be reflecting on his lunar escapade. He was the only golfer to ever swing on the moon. It's not just golf balls that astronauts left behind on their trips. there were actually a lot of objects left on the moon between 1969 and 1972, the year of the last moon landing. Each time you gaze up at the moon, remember that there's a cute family photo up there, some huge science gadgets, a small statue, a bunch of, well, human waste bags, and yes, some American flags. Years have passed by, and yes, technically those items are still hanging out there, though they've probably seen better days because of the harsh conditions on the moon. Some items had a special place in the astronauts' hearts and were meant to stay on the moon. But hey, leaving some stuff behind also meant they could bring back moon samples. You know the feeling. It's like when you need to make room in your suitcase for souvenirs when you're finishing a vacation. Does NASA have a complete list of things they left on the moon? Well, not really. In fact, one team tried to create a record of some of the items and reached an amazing list of 106 left there from the Apollo 11 mission alone. And that's not counting Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin's famous footprints. The largest items at each landing site were mostly the sciencey stuff, like pieces of their lunar module and experiments to study the moon in depth. Then there were some beautiful tokens, like Apollo 11's plaque and a special disc with messages from leaders around the world. Some say the astronauts also took medals to remember some heroic cosmonauts, and they even left a gold olive branch, an age-old symbol of peace. Now, later moon missions had a little more fun, like Alan Shepard did with his golf game. But the award for the most heartwarming moment goes to Charlie Duke. During the Apollo 16 mission, he left a picture of his family up there. It's like he wanted them to be a part of the adventure. Although, a heads up, those photos probably didn't age well because of the moon's high exposure to the sun's radiation. There might just be an art museum up there on our satellite too. Let me explain. There's this tiny little art piece called the Moon Museum. It's a ceramic chip about the size of your nail, and it was crafted by an artist named Forrest Myers. This tiny object showcases miniature artworks from 6 talented people. Among them are even the famous Andy Warhol, the same artist known for his iconic soup cans and celebrity portraits. Forrest Myers said he wanted his mini museum to be on the moon, but there was a problem. NASA officials weren't exactly on board with the idea. However, Myers shared with the press that he handed over this art chip to an engineer working on the Apollo 12 mission. According to Myers, this engineer secretly tucked the Moon Museum onto a leg of the lunar lander. In case you haven't figured it out yet, these lunar landers don't come back to Earth after their mission. Take this with a grain of salt though, as NASA has never confirmed this story. You might wonder, why did they leave all these things? Sometimes it was about making a statement. Other times, it was purely practical. At one point, it was mentioned that during the Apollo 11 mission, for example, a decision needed to be made. The astronauts had to quickly figure out what was essential for their trip back home. They ended up creating a cleanup spot, tossing away things they didn't need anymore. Leaving things behind on the moon isn't that different from how we leave things behind on Earth, just like archaeologists study our ancient leftovers to learn about our ancestors. The stuff on the moon gives us insights about those incredible lunar missions. Some things they left had done their job, like the pole for the flag or the camera they used to broadcast those steps on the moon. Even the tools astronauts used to collect samples were left because they had more precious cargo to bring back: moon rocks. When it comes to the current state of all these items, scientists are not entirely sure. We do know that NASA's Moon Observer has spotted some of their shadows. They're still up there. The official gear was built to resist, so it might behave a bit better. But those personal items? They've probably seen better days.
In November 1922, a boy walked through the desert mountains of Egypt and discovered some ancient steps carved into the rock. Subsequently, this find became one of the world's largest and most significant archaeological discoveries. This step was part of Tutankhamun's untouched tomb. Archaeologists found about 5,000 ancient objects, including jewelry, fabrics, painted vases, and funeral masks. You've probably seen one of them. It has become one of the most recognizable attributes of ancient Egypt. More than 100 years have passed since then, and now humanity has finally become close to another large-scale discovery, the tomb of Cleopatra. This queen was the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt, who sat on the throne from 51 to 30 BCE. There are many ancient records about Cleopatra, her reign, and her unusual personality, but until now, no one has discovered the secrets about her passing away in the burial place. So, one archaeologist, Dr. Kathleen Martinez, has been studying ancient records and temples around Alexandria for decades, and concluded that the tomb of the queen should be located under the ancient city of Taposiris Magna, founded in 280 BCE. It was a big city on the northern coast of Egypt, where tens of thousands of people were engaged in trade and industry, and it seems that Dr. Martinez's guesses turned out to be correct. She and a group of archaeologists have discovered a secret underground tunnel near Alexandria, with a length of about 0.8 miles. It was cut into the rock under Taposiris Magna's temple. During further excavations, they found many things that indicate Cleopatra's tomb lies in the tunnel's depths. It's also possible that she is buried there together with the Roman commander, Mark Antony. According to ancient records, Cleopatra and Mark Antony loved each other and together opposed the Roman Senate, which declared Antony a traitor. The fact that natural disasters have occurred on the territory of Taposiris Magna for thousands of years can complicate the excavations. Earthquakes and floods destroyed the city and possibly flooded its underground tunnels. But archaeologists hope the ancient tomb remains untouched, and that it hides many treasures and records about the royal life of ancient Egypt during the reign of the last dynasty. There's a chance that excavations will go underwater and in the mud. This will require much time and funding, but archaeologists are sure it's worth it. Anyway, it's too early to say that Cleopatra is really buried there, but scientists have found many things in the tunnel that confirm this, including clay pots, dozens of coins with the image of Cleopatra and Alexander the Great, as well as a bust with the image of the Egyptian queen. Cleopatra is still one of the most popular personalities in Egypt, on an equal footing with Ramesses III and Tutankhamun. She inspired many films, paintings, and books, but what made her so popular? She became famous for her inconsistency. She was a beautiful, intelligent ruler who pulled Egypt out of the crisis and made it a prosperous power. Medieval Arabic texts say she knew chemistry, mathematics, and philosophy, and may have written several scientific books. She knew several languages and had excellent diplomatic skills. At the same time, there are many legends that she was a femme fatale who drove many men crazy. However, there's no evidence that her beauty was incomparable. The image of a stunning model was created by Hollywood when it made several films where famous actresses performed the role of Cleopatra. And the Roman Emperor Octavian, the adopted son of Julius Caesar, specially created the image of Cleopatra as an insidious seductress because he was her enemy. Even though she was born in Egypt, Cleopatra wasn't an Egyptian. Her ancestors were Greeks, among whom was one of the generals of Alexander the Great. However, the people of Egypt loved her. She learned the language and was very sensitive to the traditions of this country. She knew the history, mentality, and customs of ancient Egypt well. She raised the level of its economy and strengthened its status as a world power. Much of this was made possible thanks to her cunning and impressiveness. She loved theatrical performances and lavish celebrations. She knew how to surprise people and put on a show. But behind the exterior image of a luxury lover was an intelligent and calculating ruler. Ancient Egypt was a rich, luxurious country, and Cleopatra did everything to increase its wealth and strengthen its position in the international arena. For example, she was once in conflict with her brother Ptolemy XIII Odd. The queen knew that she wouldn't be able to resist him, so she decided to attract Julius Caesar to their side. The Roman emperor arrived in Alexandria, where Cleopatra wanted to meet him, but Ptolemy knew about her plans and was about to prevent her from coming to Caesar. Then, instead of a rich and noisy arrival, Cleopatra decided to make her visit inconspicuous. She wrapped herself in a carpet or linen bag the emperor's servants carried into Caesar's private chambers. Cleopatra emerged from the carpet and impressed the Roman emperor with her beauty and determination. As a result, they fell in love with each other and became close allies. After some time, she impressed another influential Roman for diplomatic purposes. She arrived to meet Mark Antony on a golden barge with purple sails and silver oars. Cleopatra was dressed in the image of Aphrodite and sat under a magnificent canopy. Her servants dressed like cupids and were blowing her fan and burning incense. But Cleopatra created such a show for a reason. She knew that Antony revered Greek mythology and considered himself the embodiment of Dionysus. As a result, he was so impressed with this woman that he ended up marrying her. Cleopatra defended her crown, strengthened her alliance with Rome, and bore Antony 3 children. In Egypt, they threw big parties and enjoyed wealth with power. However, the relationship of a high-ranking official with the Egyptian queen caused a scandal in Rome. Octavian was Antony's primary opponent in the struggle for power, so he exploited the situation to darken the competitor's reputation. He used propaganda to make Cleopatra an insidious seductress in the eyes of Roman citizens. He accused Antony of succumbing to her charms. The Roman Senate supported Octavian and declared Cleopatra an enemy. In 33 BCE, this conflict reached a high point when Antony's navy clashed with Octavian's fleet. The latter won and forced his enemy to flee to Egypt with Cleopatra. According to some records, they took refuge near Alexandria. Pursued by the Romans, they hid in one of Cleopatra's palaces and met their end. Some legends say that Cleopatra was an expert in poisons. She provoked a venomous snake, a viper or an Egyptian cobra, to bite her. Also, according to another legend, she pricked herself with a poisonous needle. There's a theory that Cleopatra always carried an ampule with poison inside her hairbrush. And when she was cornered, she soaked the needle with this poison and pricked herself. None of this can be said for sure. Scientists are still trying to find out the truth. Perhaps when they reach Cleopatra's tomb, the world will get more answers about her tragic fate. She is considered the last ruler of Egypt. After her passing, Octavian plundered her palaces and temples and returned to Rome, where he became the main emperor. He successfully ruled the country and expanded its borders. His reign ended when he turned 75. World history would have looked different if Cleopatra and Mark Antony hadn't lost that naval battle. By the way, did you know that more time has passed between Cleopatra's reign and Neil Armstrong's flight to the moon than between the reign of the Egyptian queen and the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza? Armstrong took a step on the Earth satellite in 1969, 38 years after the birth of Cleopatra. And the construction of the pyramid took place in 2560 BCE. Imagine how long the history of ancient Egypt is. Cleopatra is closer to us in time than to the pyramids.
Many scary things are hiding in the dark when you stand on the ship deck in the middle of the boundless ocean and stare into the night distance. Your imagination begins to draw terrible pictures. But it's much worse when the horror isn't hidden and fear appears in the light under the rays of the bright sun. When endless snow plains and giant icebergs start driving you mad. Such a horror happened more than 170 years ago to the crew members of 2 large ships, Erebus and Terror. On May 19, 1845, these 2 vessels went on a great voyage through Arctic waters to open the Northwest Passage, a route between the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, passing through several icy bays of Canada. By then, both ships had gained fame after several successful expeditions in the Arctic region. Erebus and Terror were equipped with strong hulls that could withstand the pressure of polar icebergs. These were the first vessels of the British Royal Navy equipped with steam engines. Before their last expedition, engineers covered the boats with an extra iron layer to make them more ice-resistant. A lot of food, books, and coal were loaded into the cargo hold. The central stove and the sailors' cabins were connected by special air vents. Everyone was sure that an iceberg wouldn't run the ship through. Fuel and food supplies guaranteed that nobody would be hungry. In every way, those were the most equipped ships of that time for such expeditions. Erebus and Terror sailed from the English village of Greenhithe with 128 crew members. The lead of the whole expedition was Sir John Franklin. 3 months later, the ships were spotted in Baffin Bay, east of the entrance to the passage, and this was the last time Europeans saw them. 3 years later, in 1848, Captain Franklin's wife, Jane Franklin, and other caring people demanded to start an expedition to find the 2 vessels. The search continued for several years and didn't lead to anything that would reveal the secret of this terrible expedition. They didn't find the ships, but found strange clues that caused more questions than answers. So the first strange thing was the 3 graves found on Beechey Island, located in the Canadian Arctic archipelago. The crew set up a winter camp on the island shore, and for some reason, 3 out of 129 people passed away. Then the ship set off again and got in the trap. Probably Erebus and Terror got stuck in the ice near King William Island. In the middle of a snowy plain, surrounded by cold winds and ice, the crew began to experience serious problems. According to one theory, canned food contained a lot of lead. The sailors could get poisoned by that. And another view says that they got severely sick. Apparently, when the food supplies ran out, the crews went on foot to look for help, but got lost among the snowy plains. Another strange thing was a note on the shore of King William Island in the pocket of one of the crew members. Even now, no one can understand the contents of this paper. The letter had weird words and incoherent sentences like, "All my art, Tom, for I don't think for," or "shall want some grog to wet our whistle." Many words were written backward, and some were smeared. Perhaps the note reveals a secret about the loss of the crew, but it's almost impossible to decipher it. Also, the search team found another note with more understandable records. One of them is dated May 1847. It said everything was fine and the expedition was going according to plan. Another record was made almost a year later, in April 1848. It said the ships got stuck in the ice and the crew left them. The sailors planned to go to the Back River, the Canadian River in the Northwest Territories. It was their last attempt to survive, which unfortunately ended up in failure. For more than 150 years, the fate of both ships remained a mystery. But then, in 2014, a search team found Erebus. The ship's wreckage was on the island a few feet from the water. 2 years later, another expedition discovered Terror on the seabed northwest of Erebus. However, these discoveries didn't help solve the mystery of the expedition, but added even more questions instead. Terror was located 60 miles south of the place where, according to the note, the ships were abandoned. Erebus was also in the wrong place. It's possible that the crew members left the vessel, wrote about it in a note, but then returned and sailed on. Another version says that the moving ice could move the boats. In any case, we won't know what happened to the expedition. Some associate this tragedy with mystical forces. You can see this version in TV series based on these tragic events. But most likely, the crew members found themselves in an ice trap they couldn't escape. Another famous case of the vanishing of sailors happened to the ship Mary Celeste. It was built in Canada in 1861 and named Amazon. It gained notoriety right from the very first voyages of the ship. The ship changed several captains and crashed into the rocks. The broken vessel was resold a few times before receiving repairs. After the upgrade, it got a new name, Mary Celeste, and a new captain, Benjamin Briggs. He was a brave, experienced sailor with a kind heart and high moral qualities. In November 1872, with 10 people on board, Mary Celeste sailed from New York to Italy with a valuable cargo on board. A few days later, another ship, Dei Gratia, followed it along the same route from the port in New York. Somewhere between the Azores, the captain of the Dei Gratia, David Morehouse, noticed a ship 6 miles away that was sailing too strangely. It swayed from the side like no one was holding the steering wheel. David came closer and tried to contact the people on board, but there was no response. At that moment, the captain realized that it was Mary Celeste. Together with the crew members, they climbed aboard and found that its sails were slightly torn. There was water in the hold, but it could easily be pumped out. The crew's belongings were in the cabins, and the cargo was untouched. Only one lifeboat and a chronometer, which is a navigation device, were missing. The last record in the logbook said the voyage was going according to plan. Apart from the slightly damaged sails, the vessel was in perfect condition. But something forced all the crew members to leave it. Several members of the Dei Gratia crew remained on board the Mary Celeste to deliver it to the nearest seaport. One of the versions said that the water pump in the hold could be filled with coal. Before the last trip, Mary Celeste transported a large amount of this material, and some of it could have stuck inside the pump. When the ship got into a storm, the hold flooded a little, and Captain Briggs couldn't understand how critical the situation was. There were too many barrels, so he couldn't determine the water level. It was dangerous to stay on board since the ship could sink. Therefore, the captain decided to evacuate by lifeboat. Perhaps they were close to land, and Briggs decided to sail in that direction. But the storm got stronger and sank the boat. Another version says the Dei Gratia attacked Mary Celeste and got rid of its crew to get the cargo. The court couldn't prove this, but the reputation of Captain David Morehouse was damaged, and he had difficulty finding a job after that. The story of Mary Celeste became world famous, so people created many different versions. Of course, someone claimed that something mystical had happened to the ship, but such theories have no evidence. There are so many records and documents on the internet about this case, so anyone can try to sort out the truth from the fiction.